It is the night of October 23, 1942, somewhere along 60 kilometers of Egyptian desert, and a German staff officer is staring at a map that makes no sense. Reports are arriving from forward positions claiming British armored columns where there should be empty sand, and empty sand where intelligence swore the enemy's main strike force was massing. Wireless traffic crackles with the call signs of entire divisions that, as far as anyone in Rommel's headquarters can tell, have no business being where they apparently are. Somewhere to the south, engines rumble through the darkness in numbers that suggest a major thrust is building. It is not. There is no thrust there at all. What those German listening posts are hearing is theater, performed by a few hundred British and Commonwealth soldiers with a remarkable amount of canvas, a great deal of imagination, and machines designed to do nothing more than sound like something they are not. By the time the sun rises, the German command structure along the Alamein line will have spent a sleepless night preparing for an attack that never comes, while 70 kilometers north, the real assault tears into positions that had been left comparatively thin. This is the story of how Britain, with no nuclear weapon, no jet aircraft, no breakthrough in armor design, managed to win one of the most consequential battles of the Second World War partly through an elaborate and meticulously engineered lie. It matters because it demonstrates something often overlooked in the story of military technology. Sometimes the most decisive weapon is not a device that destroys, but one that deceives, and deception, properly engineered, can be every bit as effective as steel. By the autumn of 1942, the war in North Africa had become a desperate balancing act for Britain. Erwin Rommel's Panzer Army Africa had pushed the Eighth Army back across Libya and into Egypt, coming close enough to Alexandria that contingency plans were drawn up for the evacuation of the Suez Canal zone. The desert offered almost no natural cover. There were no forests to hide in, no hills to mask movement, no rivers to break sight lines. A flat, open plain stretching from the Mediterranean coast to the impassable Qattara Depression meant that any concentration of men, vehicles, or supplies was, in principle, visible from the air and detectable by ground reconnaissance for kilometers in every direction. German and Italian aerial reconnaissance flew constantly over the British rear areas, and Rommel's own intelligence staff were experienced enough to read patterns in dust clouds, vehicle tracks, and the locations of supply dumps. Montgomery, who had taken command of the Eighth Army in August, understood that he could not simply mass his forces for a breakthrough attack in the south, where the terrain favored a flanking maneuver, without the Germans noticing and reinforcing accordingly. He needed Rommel to believe the main attack was coming from the south, while in fact striking in the north along the coastal sector, where Axis defenses were comparatively weaker but where any obvious buildup of British strength would invite immediate German reinforcement. The mathematics of the problem were brutal. Eighth Army possessed roughly 195,000 men against around 116,000 Axis troops, and considerably more tanks, but a numerical advantage meant little if Rommel simply repositioned his limited but highly capable panzer divisions to meet the real threat the moment it was detected. Existing camouflage techniques, principally nets and paint, could hide individual vehicles from close inspection, but did nothing to disguise the existence of an entire armored division on the move. What Montgomery's staff required was not concealment in the traditional sense, but controlled visibility, the ability to make the Germans see exactly what the British wanted them to see, and nothing else. No existing doctrine offered a template for achieving this at the scale required. The challenge, in short, looked impossible. The man most associated with solving pieces of this puzzle was Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark, who had founded a deception organization known as A-Force in Cairo back in 1940, and whose ideas would eventually feed into the operation that became known as Bertram. Clark had already pioneered the use of dummy tanks, fake airfields, and notional military formations to confuse Axis intelligence about British strength and intentions across the Middle East, building what amounted to an entire shadow army that existed only on paper, in radio traffic, and in carefully placed pieces of wood and canvas. For the Alamein deception specifically, The planning fell to Brigadier Freddy de Guingamp and a dedicated camouflage and deception staff working under Montgomery's direction, drawing heavily on technical expertise supplied by camouflage specialists, including the stage magician turned army officer Jasper Maskelyne, whose camouflage experimental section in Cairo had been experimenting with optical illusion techniques borrowed, quite literally, from the world of theatrical magic. The technical innovation at the heart of Operation Bertram was disarmingly simple in concept and fiendishly detailed in execution. Make real things look fake and fake things look real simultaneously across an entire battlefield. In the southern sector, where Montgomery wanted the Germans to expect the main attack, hundreds of genuine tanks were disguised as ordinary 3-ton lorries using a device called a sun shield, a lightweight canvas and timber frame that could be dropped over a tank in minutes, transforming its silhouette from a low, tracked vehicle into something resembling an innocuous supply truck when viewed from the air. Each sun shield weighed only a few dozen kilograms, light enough for 2 men to lift, yet effective enough to fool aerial photographic interpreters working at altitude. Meanwhile, in the northern sector, where the real attack would actually fall, engineers built thousands of dummy vehicles, dummy guns, and entire fake supply dumps using everything from old petrol tins and scrap timber to painted canvas stretched over simple wooden frames, creating the visual signature of a massive logistics buildup using a fraction of the real material. A network of fake water pipeline construction, complete with dummy pumping stations and visible digging progress that could be tracked day by day from the air, was built to suggest that British forces would not be ready to attack in the south until weeks after the real assault was actually planned, buying crucial time before German suspicions could harden into certainty. Dummy artillery pieces made from poles and petrol drums dotted notional gun positions, while real artillery, the guns that would actually open the battle, were hidden inside specially dug pits and covered until the final hours before the barrage. Sound played its own quiet but important part. Lorries and tracked vehicles were driven along specific routes at specific times to generate the kind of dust and noise patterns associated with major troop movements, creating an auditory and visual rhythm that built a believable, if entirely fictional, picture of British intentions for any German listening post or reconnaissance pilot patient enough to watch and record it over days and weeks rather than hours. The operational results of this deception are remarkably well documented compared with many wartime intelligence stories, because Axis reconnaissance reports and intelligence assessments captured after the war confirmed that German staff genuinely believed the southern sector represented the more significant threat, right up until the moment the northern attack began on the night of October 23, 1942. Rommel himself was in Germany on medical leave when the battle opened, a fact that compounded the disorientation in the Axis command structure, and his temporary replacement, General Georg Stumme, died of a heart attack while inspecting the front lines amid the chaos of the opening barrage, leaving Axis forces without clear senior leadership at precisely the moment the deception needed to hold. Survivors' accounts and later historical analysis describe German units in the southern sector remaining alert and reinforced for a thrust that simply never materialized, tying down men and armor that might otherwise have blunted the real attack in the north. Exact figures on how many panzer units were misallocated because of the deception are difficult to establish with total precision, since Axis records from this period are incomplete and some assessments were made retrospectively, but historians broadly agree that the deception contributed meaningfully to the delay in the German response during the battle's critical opening days. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It is worth placing Operation Bertram alongside its German counterpart in deception thinking, because the contrast is genuinely instructive. German military doctrine of the period placed enormous emphasis on operational security and concealment, what they termed Tarnung, but this was overwhelmingly a defensive philosophy focused on hiding genuine assets rather than actively constructing false ones at scale. German forces in North Africa used camouflage netting and dispersal extensively and effectively, but there's little evidence of anything approaching the scale of fabricated dummy formations, fake logistics networks, or coordinated multisensory deception that the British staff built for Bertram. The Americans, for their part, would later develop their own deception specialists. Most. Famously, the unit nicknamed the Ghost Army in the European theater from 1944 onward, which used inflatable dummy tanks, scripted radio traffic, and sound recordings played through powerful speakers to simulate entire armored divisions along the Western Front. The American approach was in some ways a direct descendant of British innovations pioneered in North Africa, refined with newer technology including wire recordings of actual armored columns played back through amplification systems mounted on lorries, but the conceptual groundwork, the basic insight that an entire false army could be conjured from canvas, sound, and disciplined radio discipline, traces directly back to what Dudley Clark's organization and the Bertram planners had already proven worked in the Egyptian desert 2 years earlier. Where British deception at Alamein differed most clearly from later, flashier examples was in its sheer integration with the wider battle plan. Bertram was not a standalone trick but was woven into Montgomery's entire operational concept, timed precisely to delay German reinforcement during exactly the window the real attack needed. Assessing the actual historical impact of Operation Bertram requires some honesty about the limits of what can be proven. Nobody can say with certainty how many Allied lives were saved, or precisely how many additional hours or days the deception bought before German command fully grasped where the genuine threat lay, because counterfactual history of this kind resists hard measurement. What can be said is that the Second Battle of El Alamein became the decisive turning point in the North African campaign, the moment after which Axis forces in the region were permanently on the back foot, and that British and Commonwealth commanders, Montgomery included, consistently credited the deception plan as a meaningful contributor to that success in their own post-war accounts and memoirs. The psychological effect on German command may ultimately have mattered as much as anything physically achieved, because uncertainty about British intentions forced caution and dispersal of resources at precisely the moment concentration and decisiveness were what Axis forces needed most. The techniques pioneered for Bertram fed directly into the much larger deception architecture built ahead of the Normandy landings in 1944, where Operation Fortitude used dummy landing craft, fictional army groups, and elaborate radio deception to convince German high command that the invasion would fall at Calais rather than Normandy, employing precisely the same blend of false visual signatures and controlled information leakage first tested in the Egyptian desert. Some physical remnants of the deception, including examples of sunshield frames and contemporary photographs of the dummy installations, can be seen today in collections held by the Imperial War Museum in London, alongside the wider archive of camouflage experimental section material that documents how these illusions were actually constructed. Return, for a moment, to that German staff officer on the night of October 23, 1942, still staring at his impossible map as the real guns finally begin to roar 70 kilometers to the north. He did not know, and could not have known, that the columns he feared in the south were built from poles and canvas, that the rumbling engines he heard were lorries driving in pointless circles to manufacture dust, that the supply dumps his reconnaissance photographs had so carefully logged contained nothing but old petrol tins stacked to look like ammunition crates. He believed what he had been shown, because what he had been shown had been built, with extraordinary care, specifically to be believed. That is the quiet, unglamorous genius of Operation Bertram. It achieved, through carpentry, paint, and disciplined deception, what might otherwise have demanded thousands more lives and weeks more fighting to accomplish by force alone. No explosion, no breakthrough weapon, no feat of engineering brilliance in the conventional sense secured this advantage. A few hundred men, working with timber frames and old petrol drums, convinced an experienced and capable enemy command structure that the battlefield in front of them looked nothing like the battlefield that actually existed. The tanks that mattered wore the disguise of lorries. The lorries that mattered drove in circles to sound like armies. The army that did not exist held down the divisions that did. In a war remembered for radar, for code breaking, for the terrible new physics of the atomic bomb, it is worth remembering this too, that sometimes the decisive weapon is not a thing that explodes, but a lie that holds, built carefully enough and believed completely enough to change the course of a battle before a single shot in the real direction is ever fired.